You won't believe what happened when they thought they could push me out. Let me tell you about the moment that changed everything. Picture this. You're sitting in a sterile conference room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and your boss, someone half your age, looks you dead in the eye and says, "Jeremy, we're going in a different direction. Your services are no longer needed." My name is Jeremy Anderson. I'm 52 years old, and until 6 months ago, I was the senior project manager at Bridgewater Technologies in Austin, Texas. For 15 years, I'd been the guy who made impossible deadlines possible, who turned chaotic projects into streamlined successes, who mentored junior developers and kept million-dollar contracts from falling apart. But apparently, none of that mattered to Madison Cole, our new 26-year-old VP of Operations, fresh out of Stanford with an MBA and zero real-world experience. "We're restructuring," she said, not even looking up from her tablet. "The company needs to embrace agile methodologies and digital transformation. We need team members who can adapt to our new vision." I just sat there, watching her perfectly manicured nails tap against the glass screen. Behind her, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the Austin skyline, the same view I'd looked at every morning for over a decade while solving problems she couldn't even comprehend. "What about the Morrison account?" I asked. "The deployment is scheduled for next month." She waved her hand dismissively. "Derek can handle it. He's more aligned with our current technological approach." Derek, a 24-year-old who'd been with the company for 8 months and still needed help setting up his development environment. But he spoke the right buzzwords, wore the right clothes, and most importantly, he made Madison feel like the genius she believed herself to be. I didn't argue, didn't make a scene. Just like Stanley Rowe in that story you might have heard, I simply nodded, cleaned out my desk, and walked out with my dignity intact. But what Madison didn't know, what she hadn't bothered to check, was that my employment contract contained a little surprise. See, when Robert Bridgewater founded the company 12 years ago, he was paranoid about losing key talent to competitors. So he had his lawyers draft ironclad retention agreements for senior staff. Anyone terminated without documented cause would receive 18 months of salary as severance, and the definition of cause was very specific. I sat in my Honda Civic in the parking lot, cardboard box in the passenger seat, and called my lawyer. 3 days later, I was sitting across from Madison and Bridgewater's corporate attorney, watching her face turn pale as she learned what her impulsive decision was going to cost. "This is outrageous," she said, her voice rising an octave. "We can't pay him a year and a half of salary just because he can't adapt to modern practices." My lawyer, Patricia Martinez, a woman who'd been practicing employment law longer than Madison had been alive, calmly flipped through the contract. "The termination clause is quite clear. Mr. Anderson was let go without the documented performance issues required to constitute cause under Section 4.2. "But he was resistant to change," Madison protested. "He questioned my decisions in meetings." "Where's the documentation?" Patricia asked. "Written warnings? Performance improvement plans? Because this contract requires a paper trail." The corporate attorney, looking increasingly uncomfortable, shuffled through a thin file. Nothing. Of course, there was nothing. Madison had acted on impulse, not policy. But here's where the story gets interesting. As I was sitting there, watching Madison squirm, I realized something. This wasn't just about the money. This was about something much bigger. You see, Madison wasn't just incompetent. She was dangerous. In the 3 months since she'd taken over, she'd already driven away 2 other senior developers, canceled contracts with reliable vendors in favor of cheaper alternatives, and implemented innovative processes that had actually slowed down production by 30%. The company that Robert Bridgewater had built from nothing was being systematically destroyed by someone who thought a degree was more valuable than experience. So I made a decision. I took the severance, $180,000 after taxes, and I started making phone calls. First call, Marcus Thompson, Bridgewater's former head of software architecture, who'd been restructured out 2 months before me. Second call, Sarah Chen, our best UX designer, who'd quit in frustration after Madison rejected her carefully researched user interface improvements in favor of something more trendy. By the end of the week, I had a list of 12 former Bridgewater employees, all experienced professionals who'd been pushed out to make room for Madison's vision of a dynamic, youth-oriented workplace. The 13th call was to Robert Bridgewater himself. Jeremy, his voice was heavy with exhaustion. I heard what happened. I'm sorry. Are you? I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you handed your company over to someone who's actively destroying it. A long pause. The board insisted we needed fresh leadership. Madison's presentation was compelling. And now, another pause. The Morrison contract fell through. Derek couldn't handle the integration. We're facing a potential lawsuit. I wasn't surprised. The Morrison account was a complex database migration that required understanding legacy systems, something Derek had never worked with. But I kept my voice neutral. What are you going to do? I don't know, Robert admitted. Madison says it's just growing pains, that we need to stay the course. Robert, I said carefully, what if I told you there was another way? 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a coffee shop in downtown Austin with Marcus Thompson, outlining my plan. We'd been talking for 2 hours, and Marcus was staring at me like I'd lost my mind. You want to start a consulting firm, he said slowly, to compete directly with Bridgewater. Not compete, I corrected. Replace. At least for the clients who value experience over PowerPoint presentations. I slid a folder across the table. Phoenix Solutions. I've already registered the LLC. Sarah's agreed to handle design, you'd lead development, and I'd manage client relationships. Marcus flipped through the business plan I'd spent 2 weeks preparing. Where's the funding coming from? My severance, plus commitments from 3 other Bridgewater refugees. We're looking at $400,000 in startup capital. And clients? I smiled. Remember the Morrison account? They're still looking for someone to handle their migration. Derek's incompetence didn't just cost Bridgewater a contract. It created an opportunity. Marcus set down the folder. This is about more than business, isn't it? It's about proving that experience matters, that you can't just replace institutional knowledge with trendy jargon and expect things to work. He was quiet for a long moment. When do we start? 6 months after being fired, I stood in the lobby of Morrison Industries, waiting to present our solution to their database migration problem. Sarah, Marcus, and I had spent weeks preparing, drawing on our combined 40 years of experience to create something Madison's team couldn't match. A comprehensive, tested approach that actually worked. The presentation went flawlessly. We answered every technical question, addressed every concern, and demonstrated exactly why experience trumps enthusiasm when it comes to complex enterprise solutions. Mr. Anderson, said Janet Morrison, the company's CTO, as we wrapped up, your team clearly understands our needs in a way that other firms have not. 3 days later, we signed a $2.3 million contract, but the real satisfaction came a week after that, when Robert Bridgewater called me again. Jeremy, he said, his voice strained, We need to talk. I'm listening. The board is asking questions about Madison's leadership, about the direction of the company. A pause. About whether we made the right decision letting you go. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the Austin skyline from my new office. What kind of questions? The kind that come up when revenue drops 40% in 6 months, when 3 major clients terminate their contracts, when half your senior staff quits or gets fired. And what does Madison say? She's blaming market conditions, says we need to stay committed to the transformation process. Do you believe her? A long silence. I want to believe her. She's smart, Jeremy. Educated. She has all the right credentials. But credentials don't fix broken code. They don't salvage failed projects. They don't rebuild client trust. I let that sink in. What are you asking me, Robert? I'm asking if you'd consider coming back. As VP of Operations, Madison would report to you. I almost laughed. You want me to clean up her mess? I want you to save my company. What about Madison? She's not going to be happy about this. Madison's going to have to learn that leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about making the smartest decisions. I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. I'll consider it under one condition. Name it. I want to bring Marcus and Sarah back. Full reinstatement plus 20% salary increases for the time they were gone. Done. And I want a 3-year contract with a termination clause that makes my last one look generous. Done. And Madison agrees to this arrangement? Robert's laugh was bitter. Madison doesn't have a choice. The board met yesterday. Either she accepts the new structure, or she can find another company to transform. 2 weeks later, I walked back into Bridgewater Technologies, not as a fired employee, but as the new VP of Operations. Madison was waiting in the conference room, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. "This is humiliating," she said as soon as I sat down. "I have an MBA from Stanford. I've consulted for Fortune 500 companies. And yet," I said calmly, "you nearly destroyed a profitable business in 6 months. I was implementing necessary changes. You can't run a tech company like it's 1995. You're right. But you also can't run it like it's a business school case study. Real companies have real clients with real problems that require real solutions." Over the next hour, I outlined my plan for rebuilding what she'd torn down. Bring back the experienced staff. Restore relationships with reliable vendors. Implement actual best practices instead of trendy buzzwords. "What about innovation?" Madison asked. "What about staying competitive?" "Innovation without foundation is just chaos," I replied. "We're going to build something sustainable, something that values both experience and new ideas." She stared at me for a long moment. "You think I'm just some spoiled kid who doesn't understand the real world?" "I think you're someone with a lot of potential who made the mistake of believing that credentials are more important than competence. And you think you're so much better?" "I think I'm someone who's learned the hard way that respect is earned, not given. That leadership is about lifting others up, not tearing them down." Madison was quiet for a moment. "So what happens now?" "Now you decide whether you want to learn from this experience or let it destroy your career." She looked out the window at the Austin skyline, the same view I'd contemplated 6 months earlier when she'd fired me. "What would you do? If you were me?" "I'd admit I made mistakes. I'd ask for help. And I'd work twice as hard to prove that I deserve a second chance." "And you'd give me that chance?" "That depends on you." A year later, I stood in the same conference room where Madison had fired me, presenting quarterly results to the board. Revenue was up 60% from the previous year. Client satisfaction scores were at an all-time high. Employee turnover had dropped to almost zero. But the real success story was sitting next to me. Madison Cole, now Director of Strategic Development, had spent the last 12 months learning the business from the ground up. She'd worked alongside our senior developers, shadowed our project managers, and even spent time in technical support, talking directly to frustrated customers. The integration of traditional project management with agile methodologies has exceeded expectations, she was saying, her presentation crisp and confident. By respecting existing processes while implementing targeted improvements, we've achieved the efficiency gains we were looking for without the disruption. After the meeting, as the board members filed out, Madison approached me. "Jeremy, I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For showing me that there's a difference between being right and being effective." I smiled. "You did the hard work. I just created the opportunity. I know I cost you 6 months of your career. I know I could have destroyed this company. Could have. But you didn't. You learned from it. That's what matters." She nodded, then hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. When you were sitting in that parking lot, after I fired you, what were you thinking?" I considered the question. "I was thinking that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is being forced to prove your worth. It reminds you what you're capable of. And now? Now I'm thinking that the best leaders are the ones who can admit when they're wrong and work to make it right." Madison smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in months. "Robert asked me to stay on permanently, full-time position, not just consulting." "And?" I said yes, but I told him I wanted to work under your supervision for at least another year. "Smart decision." "Jeremy," she said as I gathered my papers, "I'm sorry. For everything. For not listening. For not respecting your experience. For thinking I knew better. Apology accepted. But remember, saying you're sorry is easy. Proving you mean it is what takes work." 2 years after my firing, I received a call from a headhunter. A tech company in Silicon Valley was looking for a VP of operations, and they'd heard about the turnaround at Bridgewater. "The compensation package would be substantial," she said. "Stock options, signing bonus, the works." "I'm not interested," I replied. "You haven't even heard the details." "I don't need to. I'm exactly where I belong." "But this is Silicon Valley. This is the big leagues." "The big leagues," I said, "are anywhere you're building something meaningful with people you respect." After I hung up, I walked to my office window and looked out at the Austin skyline. The same view I'd contemplated during my lowest moment had become the backdrop for my greatest professional success. But the real victory wasn't the promotion or the salary increase, or even the satisfaction of proving Madison wrong. It was the lesson that took me 52 years to learn. That true leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about making everyone else in the room smarter. Sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what actually matters. Sometimes you have to be pushed out to find your way back in. And sometimes, the person who fires you ends up being the one who needs you most. The business world is full of Madison Coles, bright, ambitious people who confuse credentials with competence, who think innovation means throwing out everything that came before. But it's also full of people who understand that experience isn't the enemy of progress. It's the foundation upon which real progress is built. 6 months ago, I was just another casualty of corporate restructuring. Today, I'm proof that sometimes the best revenge is simply being better than the person who wronged you ever imagined possible. And the best part? Madison Cole is living proof that even the most misguided leaders can learn to lead, if they're willing to admit they don't know everything and humble enough to learn from those who do. That's the real story here. Not just about getting even, but about getting better. About turning a moment of humiliation into a lifetime of growth. About proving that in the end, substance always trumps style, and experience always matters more than empty credentials. The next time someone tells you you're too old, too set in your ways, or too resistant to change, remember this. They're not just wrong. They're giving you the opportunity to prove just how wrong they really are. And trust me, there's no sweeter victory than that.